Hi, everybody. We're here again to talk about the Enneads by Plotinus. So we've got into the second book, and today we'll be talking about 3 chapters, but we're going to start off talking about on the motions of heaven and on whether the stars are causes, and we're going to put those together and summarize that together and kind of discuss them together because the first chapter is quite short, and they're quite related in that it deals with the heavenly spheres and the motion of them. So, Jeff, how about you tell us a little bit about what this is about?
Thank you, Sylvia. So, chapter 2.2 on the motion of heaven. So, according to Plotinus, the heavens move in circles, and it is an imitation or emulation of the intellect. He observes that the heavens, as the outermost sphere of the cosmos, are exhibiting a continuous and unceasing circular motion. So this would be what we see when we look up at the stars, the sun, the moon above. This is different from the sort of chaotic reality that we have here on the surface of the earth, whereas above you have perfect order and consistency. Now, according to Plotinus, this order of motion is not random or arbitrary, but in his mind, it's an expression of the divine intellect's activity. So the activity of thinking at the level of the intellect is characterized by constant motion or movement and the sort of unfolding of thought. And the circular motion of the heavens is a reflection of this divine activity of thinking. So the heavens, in effect, mirror or reflect or image the intellect's eternal and unchanging nature. So it's constantly moving in a circular pattern and it's never stopping. And again, this presents a sort of order that we don't have here in the chaotic material world of our everyday lives. So Plotinus in this short chapter concludes that the circular motion is not really a physical phenomenon, strictly speaking, but it's a symbol of the divine intellect's activity and nature. And this goes into the next chapter. It sets up the framework for the next chapter, where he discusses on whether the stars are causes. So this was written at a time in the Hellenistic world when astrology was very, very popular. It was widely studied, and the astrologers arguably constituted a sort of school of philosophical thought that was based on horoscopy, the casting of horoscopes, where they would interpret fate and fortune and the evolution of the world, particularly human developments, but also natural phenomena as well, based on the motion of the stars. And so to give you some background information about that, horoscopy, so the casting of horoscopes, emerges in the 2nd century BCE in Alexandria in Egypt, in the Ptolemaic, late Ptolemaic dynasty, and then it carries on into Roman Egypt as well when it becomes very popular. And so the astrologers would view the relationships of the planets relative to one another as almost having personalities. So if, for example, 2 stars with contrary natures are present together, then this would have some sort of negative influence on Earth, and they'd be looking at people's birth charts. So a birth chart is a chart that indicates the positions of the planets and the zodiac signs at the time of your birth. And so the astrologer would look at the relationship of the planets relative to one another. And in a lot of ways, they use a sort of language of personalities, as if the planets are divinities with their own preferences, and they can even cause all sorts of problems or even bestow benefits and blessings on people based on their position in the chart. Plotinus didn't agree with this at all, and he attacks astrologers, and he argues that the stars are not direct causes of human affairs, but rather that they are symbolic representations of the divine intellect's influence on the material world. And this order is, strictly speaking, not due to the stars' own preferences or arbitrary decisions and feelings. In fact, the stars don't have agency as the astrologers would assume, but instead it is a reflection of the divine intellect's orderliness and harmony. So again, this is building on the earlier chapter. And the other part of this chapter goes into a more metaphysical discussion of the relationship of the one to the intellect to the soul. And so Plotinus compares the one to a fountain, a water fountain. And so that's the source of the water. And so the fountain continuously pours water, and in a similar way, the one also continuously emanates the intellect and the forms. And as we know from earlier chapters, the intellect reflects or projects the soul, and so it gives rise to all that exists. And so this is a reciprocal relationship as well, because the intellect is always striving to return to the one, and the one is always pouring forth the intellect. So, and this is done out of necessity, not out of agency. So this is again different from what the astrologers presume, that the stars, the planets as divinities have some sort of professed interest in the world below, and that they're sort of tinkering with and manipulating our fate and fortune based on their own preferences, needs, and arbitrary ideas. But according to Plotinus, rather, the stars are can only be understood as sort of symbolic representations. And so if you understand that sort of relationship where the stars are symbolic and reflecting a sort of orderliness, then you can say that they do reflect events on Earth, but it's not because of their agency, but rather it's because of a sort of larger organic model of the cosmos and our place in it. Sylvia, what do you think?
I think that he presents an idea of astrology that is somewhat consistent, I think, with current modern Hellenic practitioners, even though historically this section, from what I've read, has been sometimes used against astrology or misconstrued to think that he completely did not believe that there was any sort of pattern or any sort of, I guess, like a divine pattern associated with the spheres. But if you read closely, that is, like you've just summarized, not the case. Rather, that the spheres being divine are not these sentient and human materialist beings that have vices that would lead to them influencing man for kind of petty reasons, rather that for reasons beyond man's understanding, they're doing their own thing. And in the book, it gives the example of much like how birds fly in different directions, for their own reasons, yet the ancient Romans and others were able to use the flight patterns and movements as a form of augury. The flight pattern itself was not the actual cause of, say, the outcome of a war, nor were the birds knowingly doing this, but that it's all part of somewhat, at least for us mortal beings, some sort of unknowable, larger connected pattern. And he brings back this concept of the universal body. He kind of makes this example of, much like we know today, a human body or any complex animal's body is made up of so many different cells, microorganisms, etc., that all work together, even though they may not be fully aware of everything else. We and everything else in the universe are part of some larger divine, I don't want to say design, because it is not make the one as a sentient being in the way we would understand the Christian God, but nonetheless that creation has instigated a certain pattern and movement, a clockwork, let's say, in which all these parts play together for reasons beyond necessarily our understanding, so that you can still look at the spheres and be able to see patterns that correlate to different events in man's life. But the part that I thought was more interesting was kind of the quote unquote wiggle room he gives on how we as embodied souls, the more we separate ourselves from the material, and the more that we look upward toward the soul, so to speak, we can gain more freedom from, I guess, certain predestined events that happen in the sensible sphere. And I think that's very telling, perhaps on a metaphysical level, even a psychological level, of the things we see all around us, the society, individuals we know and individuals who we know of, how certain people are able to free themselves of certain situations, moving away from a sort of sleeping state and just acting in a compulsive manner and really thinking things through. People who become wiser when you kind of own yourself a little bit more. And those usually are the people who either are able to have a happier, serene, and freer life, But I think that also carries over as examples of in historical figures who somehow have dictated kind of the destiny of great groups of people. But I think there's still some aspect of the self-awareness of the soul that allows people to have that level of autonomy and to have more control over events, I guess. So I think that aspect is interesting. And I think that in that second chapter, that's the therapeutic, since we're often talking about what is the purpose of reading this in for our own benefit, but the therapeutic aspect, I would say, is that often we feel so out of control, or if we believe that, our financial or health situations are completely outside of our control, if we live or attempt to live in the manner which Plotinus is suggesting, I think people will find that they more and more have a level of autonomy over themselves in a way completely different than trying to control things, if that makes sense. I'm not suggesting that his methodology is tied to the kind of control that the Stoics were against, but rather by constantly reflecting toward the soul, toward the intellectual sphere of things, toward bettering yourself in every way as a higher being, you will then, without trying to, will find ways in which you actually gain more insight and wisdom and temperance to control and self-awareness psychologically in this sensible realm to steer your own life a little better than perhaps one does when they are not introspective and are just run by impulse, basically, and reactivity.
Right, right. This brings to mind a quote of Claudius Ptolemy in the Tetrabiblos, where he suggests that, and he was an astrologer, he suggested that foresight of the future calms the soul. Claudius Ptolemy, as far as I know, was not a Platonist. He was a naturalist. He was a scientist. He viewed the stars not as divinities, but rather as natural forces. Just as the moon can visibly cause an effect on the tide, so too do the planets as natural forces draw or cast influence upon the earth. So there is, even for him, coming from a materialist point of view, a benefit to having a sort of sense of foresight of the future. And so I think with Plotinus, there is, as he points out, there is a relationship between the motion of the heavens and also the future, but again, it's not one of agency. And I think if you accept that, then maybe you even would go down slightly toward more of a Stoic path, where you recognize that there's a lot of things in reality that you don't have control over. Plotinus, of course, was not a Stoic, and he argued against them consistently, but this idea of fate was very prominent in the Hellenistic world. And the question is, so how much agency do you have? Because we're clearly governed, our world is governed by forces that are completely outside our control, whether it's the weather, but even at a basic micro level, we don't have control over many things in our own lives, such as our health. I mean, you can take care of your health, but then you can still fall ill. You're also mortal, and you're subject to injury and all sorts of unforeseen disasters. So the whole strategy in the long term is to have a mindset, as you suggest, that puts the mind at ease. And so this sort of philosophy hopefully has a sort of therapeutic value. And I guess from a religious point of view too, there's a sort of sense, especially, I mean, nowadays you have many people say that we should, put your faith in God. I mean, in God we trust, the motto of the United States. But in this case, it's not God as an agent who's overlooking your life. And it's not that you have to have a relationship personally with the one or the intellect, because in Plotinus's model, you are not separate from the divine, strictly speaking.
Right. And I wanted to bring up one other thing. So, which has already been touched upon in previous chapters. I forget which chapter, but where he's talked about free will. Having a certain mindset in which you are constantly reflecting toward your soul or your higher self, your higher soul, it obviously can have beneficial effects psychologically, behaviorally in this life, but as you said, only to a certain point, because things are just going to happen. But let's not forget that for him, the embodied aspect, the material, is chaos. It's null. That the reason we have free will is we have to remember it's not what happens in this sensible plane of existence. It is because the soul, even though it's enmeshed here, there is still the soul, which is really outside of time and outside of the sensible world, and it is the soul that has free will. So our free will is not really what's going on here. It's a hard concept to kind of delineate because the two things are enmeshed, and that's how we experience reality. But there is the soul, which in a sense is the only aspect that has free will, which is, and therefore, on the other hand, all of that is predestined, that we don't have any control over, is really just the sensible world experience that we are going through as mortal living beings. At least that is my interpretation of some of the nuance there. Therefore, everything, and the other aspect, as you were starting to say, is we are not separate from the one. The soul is just an emanation, like the fountain example of water coming out and continuing to, fall into the basin or whatever and ripple out, but it's all the same stuff. It's just further out from the source. And in that way, we are indirectly or directly the one. We're just, as we've already said, not aware of it. So being part of the one, when we are freed of either the blindness we're experiencing in this world, or actually finally when we are freed from our mortal bodies, and none of the experiences of this realm are really matter or really had any true effect on our true self, which is the soul.
Right, right. And so the more you orient yourself toward the stars, you look up to the stars figuratively, and more literally, the more you orient yourself toward the soul, the intellect, the one, the less attached and concerned you'll be for material things. And that's a good point to transition into the next chapter, because Plotinus talks about the nature of matter, which is one of the key points of his treatise, and it's also one of the key points of this therapeutic program that
I think it's
he has in mind.
sorry to cut you off. I think it's interesting that this specific author put it in this order. I guess I see it on one level. It would go along. It depends on which level you're looking at the topics. If you're looking at them from the sensible realm or the intelligible, or more of a metaphysical perspective, because it kind of makes sense in the sensible realm to think of matter going along with, cosmology. But I could also see how the chapter on matter would have gone along with the chapter on evil from a more metaphysical perspective. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up as we start talking about this chapter, that he talks about his concept of matter is twofold, but that again, matter fundamentally is evil. And so it kind of ties together the metaphysical aspect and the sensible realm description, kind of the natural science of his time that he brings into some aspects of these chapters. The structure of the universe and how they interconnect and intertwine. So sorry to cut you off, but if you want to give us a little more on this chapter.
Sure. So the chapter on matter, Plotinus basically draws a distinction between intelligible matter and sensible matter. So sensible matter is what we experience at the physical world, and then intelligible matter is the basis for physical matter. So matter is created by the idea of difference or differentiation at the level of the intellect. So in which the differentiation of the forms take place. So at the level of the intellect, you have the forms, but there has to be a differentiation between them. And so that is the idea of differentiation. And so intelligible matter is equated to this concept of differentiation. Because if there wasn't differentiation, then you would just have the totality, wholeness of all forms, and they wouldn't be differentiated. So maybe we could draw an analogy between white light going through a prism, and then once it goes through that prism, it's differentiated into its different colors. Whereas before that point, it's all just one mass of white light. So intelligible matter is indefinite, and this is a reflection or image of the one, a sort of infinity. And sensible matter is indeterminate, which is a reflection of the indefiniteness of intelligible matter. So intelligible matter is represented by the indefinite dyad, duality. And so this is the point from which the one starts to differentiate itself into the multiplicity of forms. So you have the sort of oneness or wholeness, and then it's divided into multiplicity of forms. And there's two aspects to the dyad. So there's one that's receptive and one that's productive. So the receptive is like empty space, and the productive is the source of change and movement. And that's the impetus for the soul, and then by extension of that, the material world, the expression.
Are you talking about the material of the sensible world or the material of the intelligible world right now?
So this is the intelligible matter, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want to point out, I mean, you have pointed out, but that early on he kind of speaks to, well, what is matter? Are there different types of matter? And he does make the distinction that in his opinion, there's a matter that exists here in the sensible realm, and there's a different type of matter, which is the one you're speaking of right now.
Right, that's the intelligible matter.
Right, correct. And they are
the sensible.
And in a sense, they act functionally similarly for their respective spheres, but they are actually different things.
Right. So so as a result of that, matter, physical matter, sensible matter is a image. So it's basically an image of the intelligible matter at the level of the intellect. And so it's in that sense a byproduct, but it's not. So, and again, this is all coming out of necessity. It's not something that forms out of agency at the level of the one or the intellect. It's not like there's some sort of divine decision to create physical matter, but rather it's just the spontaneous, natural necessity of the one being expressed. So Plotinus also discusses magnitude. So magnitude being, dimensions and the sort of spatial functions of matter. And matter is necessary for sensible matter to exist and function because it's otherwise passive. So sensible matter in the physical world is receptive, it's passive. It doesn't have any sort of strict determinate form. Its dimensions only come to exist because of the forms at the level of the intellect. And magnitude provides matter also with structure and dimension so that it can take on forms and to become physical objects, and that's what we perceive. Plotinus suggests that sensible matter basically is a deficiency of form, but it's also an inevitable remainder or residue of the process of creation. And so, to quote him, Plotinus says, privation is in fact neither a quality nor something qualified, but rather an absence of quality or of something else, just as soundlessness is not a quality of sound or of anything else. So, as a result of this, you can qualify matter as evil because it's deprived or poor. But that's not strict, that's not like suggesting that matter is evil because of some sort of moral issue, but rather just because not having any sort of quality onto itself, it's not worth investing yourself in, and it's the furthest away from the one, the good, so it ought to be qualified as evil. And as a result of that, by extension, I think that you would want to avoid attaching yourself to it or being overly invested in matter because it is deprivation, indefiniteness. And I think by extension, then you could also raise a sort of moral quality to this as well and say, well, if matter is basically evil, then the sort of experiences that we tie ourselves with to matter are also probably going to be problematic. So the more we become attached to material possessions, our material bodies, these sort of things. I'm not saying that to completely avoid them, but the more that we are invested in it, the more we're investing basically into something that is basically evil and not beneficial in the long term. That's my reading of this. What do you think, Sylvia?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one of the key takeaways is, I think, self-aware. Just be very aware that that is the case, and that our entire experiences, sentient animals, is one in which everything is to some level obfuscated or an illusion, and just to keep that in mind, so that you, and to have that ever present with you, or build that as part of your whole worldview, will help avoid falling into the illusion of giving levels of importance to matter and to material things that ultimately have a negative effect on one psychologically, which in my opinion is the image or manifestation of the soul, of your intellect. So I think, I don't know if, I mean, people could take this information and go different ways with it and go toward total asceticism. But I think even simply living with a level of awareness and trying to therefore measure everything that you do with the worth that it actually has is reasonable enough to live a serene life, or at least attempt to. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, well, why is matter in the intelligible world not evil, and why is our matter evil? I don't know if you mentioned the fact that the matter in the intelligible world is not indefinite, it's definite. So the matter in the sensible world is indefinite because it can be anything, but he points out that, matter can only be one thing at a time, right? But it has no qualities of its own. It's just the images of forms. Whereas in the intelligible realm, intelligible matter is definite. It isn't mutable. It is all the forms all at once, which I think is an important differentiation that he brings up. So it is creating all of the forms, but it's creating all of the forms all at once. And it's, I don't want to say constant, because that gives it is in a sense a constant. It's outside of time and it's immutable. And by having an actual definite form, which is all of the forms, all of the divine forms, it clearly can't be evil. It's creating all of the manifestations of the intelligible that are good. So I think that's an important differentiation to make between the two types of matter, that I'm not sure if we punctuated that or not.
My reading is that the intelligible matter is differentiation, not creation. So it's a process in the creation, in the
Right.
long
Yeah, I
term.
don't think it creates it. It can't,
Right.
because everything, creation would suggest some sort of linear timeline, and he says as much. But I am agreeing, it does differentiate, but it is also all of the forms at once, but it's also differentiating as all of the forms as once. It's not doing one at a time, and it's all the same intelligible matter being all of the differentiated forms at once, which might be
it's the differentiation of all of the forms, and
right.
then by extension you have the indeterminateness of matter, which is passive receptive and is also differentiated constantly because it's in different forms depending on the point in time that you're observing it, and it has no sort of consistency or constancy. So the intelligible matter is
Well,
not
he says it
evil.
in 2.4.8. The matter of the intelligible realm is devoid of particulars, which insinuates it's all of them at once. It's not one thing at a time. It still differentiates them. I guess my point is just that the fact that the matter in the intelligible realm is definite indicates its goodness, versus the indefinite nature insofar as its lack of any kind of quality. And that being its only differentiation is that it has no quality in the sensible realm. Therefore is basically nothingness and illusion, and as you said, not worthy of, making the pinnacle of one's existence.
Right. It's not something that you should invest in, which is at complete odds with the mainstream view of the modern, particularly Western world. We're effectively entirely invested in material lives, and our ideas of the physical world, metaphysics as well, is entirely informed by concepts of matter and energy and so forth. So even with people who, for example, like, I mean, in the New Age movement, often people will describe immaterial relationships with analogies to energy, or suggest that there's some sort of underlying energy working between different people and so on. But this is completely at odds with what Plotinus is proposing, that the matter of the physical world is just a reflection, and it's not even something that you should really invest in. So he's not saying that matter doesn't exist, like it's not completely non-existent. It's just that it's privation, and
Yeah, it's total lack of any sort of quality. And he gives an example earlier in the chapter where he says if you walk into a room, you don't see darkness as by seeing darkness. You just note its existence by it there being absence of light. But that doesn't mean darkness doesn't exist in a sense, right? It's can be experienced, but it's simply the privation of light.
right. And that's actually an interesting point too, is that maybe we can qualify matter not as something that really exists in a hard ontological sense, but rather it's an experience. We experience matter, and that kind of takes us more towards an idealistic point of view.
Yeah. I wonder, as I was reading this chapter, I was wondering that what his concept of matter in the sensible world is in relation to the theory that's currently pervasive that the majority of matter in the universe is dark matter, and from what I understand of dark matter, at least how humans can perceive it, or how we can perceive it even with the technology we have, is very similar to his definition of matter as privation, but that it is noted only in relation to it creating absences or its like influence on things around it, but not it being having any quality itself, because it's not like a dark, it's just you can't see it. They only note it in relation to the effect it has on like gravitational pulls of things. I thought that was kind of interesting. I wonder if there's some sort of connection there.
Well, I hope that some scientists also still read Plotinus. Physicists might also get some sort of ideas from these old Hellenic thinkers, but I'm not sure about that.
Maybe a few, but I know that there's religious people in that field, but I don't know if they're the kind of religious people who are reading Plotinus.
Right. I mean, when there's discussions of religion and science, overwhelmingly in the English-speaking world, it tends to be between Christian thinkers, intelligent design advocates who are often affiliated, it seems, with a Christian faith, and scientists who generally either knowingly or unknowingly subscribe to logical positivism. So that's usually what we're left with. Although sometimes they discuss science and religion, and then Buddhists, for example, the Dalai Lama or representatives of Tibetan Buddhism are sometimes involved in that as
But
well.
I think one of the reasons there's discussion that is usually Judeo-Christian is because, at least as far as I can think currently, it's the main religion that actually created a clash with the idea of natural sciences in modernity or in the Middle Ages, even before, I guess, in late antiquity, because I can't really think of other polytheistic or animist or ancestor worship style religions that pre-existed or in some places still exist that necessarily saw empirical study as being, inconsistent with the gods or with the spirits of reality, but simply a different way of perceiving it, or only a certain level of perceiving as we can. I don't know if I'm being clear. I think it's the religion that has had the most clash in history with the pursuit of knowledge through empiricism. Therefore, it's the one that obviously is going to be highlighted when there's comparisons, because the other ones have had pretty much a non-issue with science or the pursuit of empirical knowledge.
Well, I guess with the early modernity, with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and then industrialization, Christianity was the religion or religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, of Europe. And
Right.
when you, for example, look at Buddhism really only has to start discussing empiricism and Western science in the 19th century, when science and industrialization have basically become part of the imperial power structure of the new global order. Although I would say, from like a Buddhist studies point of view, Buddhism doesn't necessarily have any problems with empiricism or even the materialist investigation of reality, because various Buddhist traditions, which have different theories of mind, are primarily concerned with what we could call soteriology, liberation from suffering. The whole point
Right.
of these Buddhist philosophical traditions is not to explain the fundamental ontological truths of the physical world. Buddhism accepts that there is a physical world, but
Right.
the problem is that our experience with it and our perception of things inevitably leads to suffering. And so it's trying to provide a remedy for that. So when
Well, the crux is that there isn't the concept of a sentient interventionist God who has created a world that is not an illusion, is real, maybe fallen. And I mean, it's also the politics of the control of information that was pervasive from late antiquity, early the Middle Ages, well into the Enlightenment by the Catholic Church, and then different Protestant groups or the Church of England, etc. All built on this idea of things having maybe a directly divine interventionist causality versus the idea of a god or a sentient or something higher than us simply putting into play something and letting it play out. That is certainly not the God of the Bible. He's not, passive in whatsoever. I think that's I guess I'm agreeing with you, but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying the reason that I think generally when we even hear about discourse in modernity about religion and science, this is going to be about Christianity, or I guess to some degree the other Abrahamic religions, because they're the ones who've had these issues. Why would a religion, and I don't know very much about Buddhism, but why would a worldview that basically thinks this is real but also an illusion care about, like, yeah, sure, investigate it, but it doesn't ultimately really matter anyways. But
right,
yeah,
it depends on, it also depends on the level that you're examining
right,
reality. So Buddhists do have a cosmology, they have a theory of elements. And I think if you were to take the classical thinkers of Buddhist antiquity and put them in the modern day, they would be fine with reconfiguring their theory of elements to match the periodic table and so on.
sure, but they also probably, maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, are the different sutras and different books, they're usually written by monks, or I guess like the Bible, to negate the Bible from a Christian perspective is basically to say it's not God's word. So to them it's blasphemy because it's all divinely inspired, aka God was talking to these people and they literally wrote down what God wanted them to write down.
Buddhist sutras
Uh,
generally are the words of the Buddha, although the problem is that there's hundreds, thousands of sutras, and there's different traditions that accept some of them but reject other ones. And then there's also large geographical disparities because of, historical links being severed, or people going into different directions. But basically the idea is that you have the sutras, which are the core ideas that were proposed by the Buddha, canonized, and then you have the thinkers on top of that that try to build upon that. So it's kind of like Plotinus building on Plato.
right. So the cosmologies that you are referring to, if you recall, are those from sutras that are supposed to be seen as actual words of the Buddha, or more, glosses based off of that, and then stipulations done later by other monks, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so there are some core ideas, like for example, the theory of elements and so forth. And that would have just been considered like a authoritative truth based on the words of the Buddha. But that didn't necessarily stop people at later points from reinterpreting things to suit a new philosophical idea. So they're still adhering to the word of the Buddha, but they're sort of offering a new interpretation. And so I don't think that there would have, like, I'm just hypothesizing that if you were to take the ancient Buddhist thinkers like Asanga and Nagarjuna and put them in a university today, they wouldn't necessarily have any objections to adopting the periodic table of the elements, especially if you can demonstrate empirically that this works. But then they would say, oh, but the purpose of our philosophy is liberation from suffering. So it's good that we can understand this material world, but we have to go beyond that. Whereas materialist science is arguably amoral because it's based on empiricism and the pursuit of the truth, and it's not interested, strictly speaking, with
as it should
with the
be.
moral question of suffering.
Right. The problem isn't having empirical materialist way of investigating or interacting with the sensible world. The problematic aspect is that that whole system is now seen as the apex of reality and that there is nothing beyond that. And to think otherwise is ludicrous and pointless. And to see science as superior as a form of wisdom and as the superior way for humans to have knowledge. And it's completely, I think, annexed the actual concept of knowledge, where knowledge is only seen as something tied to empirical investigation and nothing else. I think that's the problem from my perspective, and probably the perspective of others who have what some people would call a more spiritual or philosophical leaning and think that there's more to life than the material.
Right. And I think in America, the reaction to the triumphant success of materialist science is people proposing that, well, you just need to turn to the Bible, generally speaking, because of the sort of overwhelming power of the Christian movement in the United States. But
also the kind of denominations that evolved or came to the United States, I think, are a major reason why there's this huge clash that you don't really see as much in Europe, even though atheism is up in Europe. But I think it has a lot to do with the culture and the specific demeanor or behavior of some of the post-Reformation Protestant sects that came to the United States, different types of Calvinism. A lot of the fanatic forms of Christianity that went to the United States, often because they were not wanted, and they were either exiled or they were risking death staying in Europe. So clearly a very fanatical mentality, what I would call fanatical or very fundamental mentality of that type. And then on the other hand, the modern fundamentalist scientific way of looking, materialist, atheistic way of looking at things are obviously going to constantly be clashing with each other. They're natural antagonists.
Well, the point I'd like to make is that, particularly in America, by extension Canada as well, that there's not necessarily, for most people, a choice. There's either you are going to follow mainstream science as your worldview and probably enjoy the consumerism on top of that, or there's the Bible. But people aren't really necessarily aware that you have other options, like you can read Plotinus or you can study Stoicism. I mean, there are, of course, people who read Stoicism and Plotinus and so forth, but it's not really part of the mainstream. It's something that, some people, a very small number of people do. And I think the success of Buddhism in the English-speaking world, at least some form of it, whether it be Tibetan Buddhism or Theravada, is maybe can be attributed also to the intellectual side. The fact that you do have a living tradition of Tibetan Buddhist philosophers, many of whom you can interact with, you can meet with them, and there's even a community that you can, read these texts with and experience it with them. So you're just not sort of left on your own. Whereas a lot of people don't necessarily have that, so they're left with.
I think there's another way too, though. I think that not that I prefer Christianity, but everything that happened after the Enlightenment and the negation of God or of providence is the reason there's this idea that you have to pick one or the other. But the majority of, at least in the West, of scientists and innovators and inventors up to the Enlightenments were usually clergy. There is no reason that one cannot, believe in the Bible, realize that you can be investigating the empirical world. And I think the problem is just the blindly following everything together of either of these schools of thought. And when it comes to the material, when it comes to science, quite frankly. It's not even just about science. It's a political posture now where if you believe in science, you must have these kinds of other political ideas. You must not believe in anything divine, etc. Who said that? Well, what does that have to do with the empirical method? Nothing.
Yeah, even in the humanities, I think we can be scientific scholars without within our writing making any sort of religious proclamations or expressing beliefs or structuring our arguments and ideas around our own religious confessional beliefs. And so I think that's also possible with science, and I'm sure many scientists
Yeah.
do have, their own ideas of divinity and faith and
I think a lot of
providence.
them do. I think a lot of this is rhetoric from the media, which then negatively affects the masses. But I don't think that what people believe, what is echoed in the tunnel of media and social media and news bites and the zeitgeist is not even probably a realistic representation of the inner thoughts of people in academia. I think it's a mix. Perhaps it's frowned upon to be religious, but at the same time, I have a hard time seeing how, if that was actually enacted, how someone would not get a lawsuit. I think the importance there, which is probably in reputable research universities, people just keep very separate their personal beliefs from the specific task at hand of investigation empirically of whatever they're looking into. And there's
Right.
no reason why you can't have both. As we've discussed in this chapter, they're clearly separate. The matter and what we can investigate in the sensible world is not the same as whatever everything else might be, right? At a higher level.
Right. I guess my proposal would be that also we can step aside from using even an idea of religion or religious, because that implies institutional organized religion,
Right.
and suggest that, for example, you could be a scientist and also read Plotinus and get some sort of ideas about reality, or even like a worldview that's not at odds with your task of investigating material reality. It would just give you a nuanced or fresh viewpoint on this.
Well, unfortunately, philosophy is in general in the scientific world is, and I guess the zeitgeist is being like irrelevant, that psychology and philosophy are pseudosciences and totally irrelevant. And the only thing that matters is science. I used to be one of those people. And I remember speaking to some philosophers at the time, or students of philosophy. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that they thought there was a whole other topic that was worth investigating if you couldn't investigate it through empiricism. I think it's just this whole mentality that over decades has now entrenched itself, which has created this large divide. It's really like a real mentality switch. And if you haven't experienced that personally, I have. I don't know how to explain it. It's really like one of those things that you can't explain unless you've experienced it. Much like I guess people who say they gain faith or lose faith. I'm sure there are people who are, reading philosophy and stuff, but I think a lot of young students, once they choose to go in one direction or another, and also is philosophy. Well, let's not even talk about the state of like the high school system in America the illiteracy level and also the problems are outrageous. But I don't think most kids are even, they have no exposure to philosophy really. Maybe more so, maybe I'm being negative. Maybe through the internet now they do. Maybe even through something as silly as all the Stoic memes or all these YouTubers who I don't think they're like really representing Stoicism correctly, and they're just kind of watering down Marcus Aurelius. But even that is better than nothing, because then people who have a true interest as they get older will go down that tunnel and find more substantial information.
Right. And on that point, it's probably a positive note to end, that hopefully in the future, people will be exposed more to philosophy through potentially memes and popular YouTube speakers
like us.
And hopefully there's
we'll
a sort
popular.
of new renaissance of philosophy. So thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.